to Policy Drivers, our video podcast where we have the chance to talk to leaders in planning and policy who are helping make Texas a better place to live. Today, we have the chance to talk with Dr. Carol Lewis. She is a current professor of transportation studies at Texas Southern University. She has her master's in planning from University of Iowa and her PhD in political science with emphasis in public policy and public administration from the University of Houston. As a professor, she enjoys educating her students about the fundamentals of transportation, the connection to urban transportation issues, and conducts her own operational and policy-related transportation research. Before coming to the university, Dr. Lewis was the manager and director of planning for the Metropolitan Transit Authority of Harris County for 15 years. Mayor Anise Parker appointed her to the Gulf Coast Rail District in Houston-Galveston area, and Mayor Turner and County Commissioners Court named her as chair in July 2019. In addition, Lewis serves on the H-GAC Transportation Policy Council. That was a mouthful there. So welcome, Dr. Lewis. Thank you so much for being here today. I would love to give you the space also to introduce yourself, and just in case I missed something, let the listeners know.
No, I think you covered it, and I know that we want to get into your questions. So I think that part is probably far more interesting than my background.
Well, wonderful. We're very excited to have you here today. So one of our questions we always really like to ask at the beginning for all of our policy drivers here on our little video podcast is, when you were getting into this space, it's probably, I feel like we're about to get thrown in. So what do you wish someone had told you when you were first getting started in this public policy space, and what kind of valuable advice can you give us and our viewers that are planning to go into this space either in the next couple of weeks, months, or even years?
Well, I think probably from your vantage point, the biggest piece of advice I could offer is be patient. You will want things to happen very quickly, and they don't. I will tell you that my students all know that my favorite article ever is The Science of Muddling Through by Charles Lindblom, written in 1959. And I don't know if you all have had it in your backgrounds, in your academic backgrounds, but his basic thesis is that government can only move incrementally, that government is incapable of making sweeping change. And so I didn't know when I was reading it as a graduate student that that would end up being my favorite article. But after I had worked for several years at Metro Houston, it just kept kind of popping into my mind, muddling through, muddling through, muddling through. So I think that's the biggest thing, that when you get out here, the dynamics are so broad, so varied, the interests so broad, so varied, that it takes a while to kind of find the Venn diagram sort of space in the middle where you can get folks to overlap and agree on something and move forward. So I think that's the sort of the basic thing, is that, Rome isn't going to be changed in a day. It's going to take a while, but keep at it. Don't not try, right? Because you have to keep at it, and those incremental changes will happen. And then at the end of X number of years, you will have had kind of a sweeping move that you had wanted in the first place and wanted to happen more quickly, but it won't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it seems so obvious, right? Patience, but I think it's something that we forget in the policy space, because we want these things to happen and we want there to be sweeping change, and why can't this happen? And it's so easy. Can't you just write a law? And it isn't that easy, but that's why we fight for it, right? Because it's important. Correct. And it's nice to see these incremental changes that you or your fellow policymakers that are kind of in there making sure they get finished. So I'll have to look up that article, because I have not read that yet. I don't know about Madeline and Tynan, but it seems like something we probably should have read. So I'm going to put that on my list. So what were some maybe new skills that you found you needed to either adjust to or learn in order to get working in this space?
So the thing that is going to happen is that technology is going to change. So when I first start, whenever I hear people kind of talk about my background, I start thinking, okay, don't do any math. But when I first started working, this is the honest to goodness truth. Computers were the size of rooms. And when I first started working at Metro, In order to do our travel demand modeling, the only place in town that had the computer capability to run that model was at Rice University. So we had to take all of our things. This is the public transit agency. We had to take everything we wanted over to the university to get our demand maids run. Well,
Wow.
now, my phone, yes, it is. Now, sorry about my mask.
It's important.
It really, you can do the same thing on your phone.
Yeah.
So the biggest change is to keep up. I did not learn GIS in college, but I tell all my students the most important skill set for you to have right now is GIS, because you can't really work without it. So sort of the answer to that question is your skill set is always going to be morphing, and you have to kind of keep up with it. Okay, so we don't want to take time because I'll also tell you about how we used to do maps. I'm not gonna tell you. I'm just gonna laugh and stop.
I want to hear about that. That's so interesting, though. If you can stand, that would be wonderful. I would.
Okay.
I took a survey. Oh, sorry.
A piece of paper covered with mylar. Do you know what a mylar is? Okay, it's basically thin, some transparent, plasticky kind of stuff that's hard. You'd cover it with that. You'd grab your colored pencils, and you'd go to work. Or you could get your tape. So you'd have, you know, a piece of tape, you'd have it in different colors, red, blue, green. You'd have hash if you want to do hash. So you'd have a hashtag kind of tape, and you'd put all this on your mylar, right? Because you didn't want to mess up your base map because you only had one base map. So you had to do all your changes on the mylar so you could, you know, kind of pick and choose and mask and move around. So it's interesting kind of sidebar story. This was a long time ago, probably like, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. And I almost want to call names, but I won't. So the thing that happens as you ascend in your organizations and you become a manager, you quit doing those hands-on things, right? Because you have the younger entry-level people to do the hands-on, and you're just kind of directing. Well, one day we were doing some kind of project. I can't even remember what it was. And so I was sort of mid-level. I wasn't really the person who did it all the time, but you know, a lot of times you can get the best work from the younger people, the younger minds, you know, bending over the maps and, you know, stripping it out, right? So I called this meeting one day at TxDOT, and I had all these mid-level manager people coming because we wanted to get in, you know, strip it out and, you know, put all the things on. I really wanted some, you know, out of the box thinking. So we get to the meeting, and in walks Art Story, who was the head of Harris County Toll Road Authority, and Gary Treach, who was the head of TxDOT at the time. Now here's the rub though. They walked in because they wanted to do this. You know, you get to that level of management and directorship and you never get to do that anymore. You know, you're not bending over the paper anymore. You're not doing the stripping. You're not doing the coloring. Mm-hmm. And then here they come because they wanted to do it too. So I guess the point I'm making is now all of that's done on a map, you know, and if you need to know some kind of whatever the software is that does it on the map for you now. So it kind of, in a way, it kind of moves that away from people who honestly kind of like to do it. And to a degree, maybe it's not as good because you're not as close to the actual, you know, components and concepts behind the rationale that's coming out on the map. But the thing is, that was a sidebar story about how we used to do things, and you know, on the heels of your saying, no, tell us, how did you used to do your mapping? So anyway, that's that story. So you should come to my class sometimes because we do this a lot. That's what I do with my students. They get the benefit of all of this history.
That's great. That's awesome. I think it is still very relevant. I mean, just the story about drawing the maps, because I talk about this book, my mom, a lot, like this hands-on work is just kind of, it's disappeared, sadly. And yes. I mean, there are, of course, you know, maybe there's some people who still learn a trade, but for some, we're all on our phones, we're all on our computers, and there is that valuable, you know, looking at GIS, we're like, wow, look at all these cool layers, and that's so interesting. But that used to be, we would put the layers on top by ourselves. And
on Mylar.
Yeah, on Mylar, yeah. So I think that's a very interesting story.
I took a land surveying class as part of my major as an undergraduate. And that was extremely hard. Like I was in marching band, so I was used to like measuring my steps out carefully, so that was okay. But once I had to translate taking steps outside onto a piece of paper that accurately reflected the distances, that something about that math in particular just turned my brain inside out. And it's really impressive that people can use that as such an effective tool.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that's really interesting. And that's something no one has really talked with us about yet, is adapting to technology. And I think it's important, especially when you're talking about Dr. Lewis being kind of at a different level and kind of, or we're seeing and directing and missing that, maybe doing that kind of hands-on work. So I think that's something that we haven't heard yet. And I think that's also very valuable, just to remember, don't forget all those skills that you had, and they
Right.
could be useful. They most likely will be useful later.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm curious to know how working in policy within a transit agency is kind of different than working in policy in any other role, and what kind of, in your opinion, are the advantages or disadvantages, and maybe both or either of those.
Mhm. I don't know that it is different. I think it's probably very much the same. And the probably the key element to any agency is the agency head. So one of the things that I've discovered across time is that the agency head actually sets the tone and direction for the entire organization. I can't remember what year in my career it was that I kind of realized that any agency takes on the characteristics and thinking and posturing and culturing of its head. So the leader is absolutely critically important. And the reason I say I think it is largely transferable is one of the most effective agency heads we had at Metro when I was there, and we worried about it. I'm a transit person, transit and the transit stream and so forth. And so our agency heads had always been transit people before. Well, one year, it was this in the 90s, they decided, because the head of Metro is appointed by the mayor of the city of Houston. So one year, the mayor at the time had our agency head to be a man who was from basically a public works background, Bob McLennan. And he had been, over the Army Corps of Engineers, and then he went and did some things in the City of Houston's Public Works Department. And then, he's coming to Metro with no transit background. He didn't need it because he was a good leader. He was a good agency head. He knew how to hire the people in the various operational streams that had the capabilities in the discipline areas needed. So he was my first time of actually seeing that a really good administrator can manage the transit agency and manage it quite effectively, as long as your operational person is a transit person, as well as your capital transit person who's building your parking rides and all that, as long as that person's, background and strength is in the area that that person is operating in. It's not the transit piece that you need all the way from the head. And so it's how that is administered. So that's how I would, sort of address your question, that a good administrator can actually step in and administrate anything. Another person who was at Metro, and I learned this from Shirley DeLibero. Shirley DeLibero was the head of Metro when we finally got our first 7 miles of rail, and she did it all the way around the barn. She got, around all of the hindrances that we had had for decades. And this was the thing about her that I remember, and I learned this from her. She actually verbalized, "I hire to my weakness." And so that's another thing to kind of take away as you guys, kind of ascend these ladders. You want to figure out where you're not strong and hire strong people where you're not strong. So I think that kind of, addresses what you ask, I think, in terms of how do you get these agencies administered? Do you need something different depending upon what the policy areas are? And I would say the answer to that is no. You need a really good administrator who understands how to manage people and understands what they as a agency head do well, understand what it is that they don't do well, and make sure that they hire what they don't do well.
Yes,
You know,
really important.
we're later today, actually, we'll be talking to James Bass, who's the
Mhm.
CEO of TechStot, and we talked
Mhm.
about how he and Tom Lambert are kind of a similar story of a career person with the agency, but who wasn't in the sort of policy and planning. You know, that James Bass was from the finance department, and Tom
Mhm.
Lambert came from the Metro's police department, and they
Mhm.
both have
Mhm.
proven to be great leaders
Mhm.
of agencies.
Exactly.
Um, and even though they maybe Tom Lambert wasn't a transit nerd when he started,
Right. Yeah, exactly. He was a law enforcement nerd.
yeah,
And I'm going to tell you, he still is. He still is a law enforcement nerd.
yeah,
That doesn't go away.
I really appreciate that response though, because I think it really is about the leaders and the administrators and how it trickles down. I mean, if in hiring to your weakness, that is so important, because you can, I mean, I say you as like a general you, or we
Mhm.
as
Mhm.
individuals can't
Mhm.
do everything. It's
No.
impossible. I mean,
No.
maybe there are a couple very eccentric special people who can do everything, and that wows me, but it is very, very valuable advice to hear from you, and just facts that
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
leader and the administrator needs to be the strength of the organization or the policy entity. I just think that
Mhm.
it's wonderful. I really appreciated that response, so hit the nail on the head, as I would say. So kind of off of that question and more specific into the transit world itself, what do you kind of wish from being in this space that other people who maybe you work with or other policymakers who aren't in the transit space, what do you wish that they kind of understood better about the transit world that would maybe make getting policy through a bit easier?
I think people don't understand the importance of transit. They just don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and that just covers a gamut of things they don't get, right? So what is it that they don't get? I think they don't get that the transit is actually the backbone to the transportation in your community. Your
Yes,
essential workers are going to get where they're going on transit, and we should be paying for that. I think the
absolutely.
other thing people don't realize is somehow in people's mind, um, driving let me change the way I'm going to say that. People don't recognize the full cost of driving their car. They don't realize how much of that cost is being borne by the public sector
Yep.
because it's buried and hidden. And so, thusly, we're not spending nearly enough on the transit. All right, so what are some of the other things that they don't get? They don't get that the reason our transit system is as far behind where it could be is because of how we've spent our money since the early 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you look at our history, the first federal money, was spent on roads in 1912. And from what I've been able to pull, that 1912 allocation was from the federal government to pay money for a rural road so that the people could get their mail. The first time the federal government spent money on public transit was 1960. Okay.
Mm.
So you've got a 60-year gap in. Can you all hear that phone? Sorry if you can.
It's okay. Happens.
I've got my mask. I'm working from home. We haven't been on campus since March 18th. And
Oh wow.
when the phone is close to me, I just shut it off, but it's across the room. So,
It's
but
okay.
but when you have that kind of gap in money coming from the federal government to pay for something, of course we're going to be behind. Of course. And so transit agencies were actually, okay, back up and put on that Dwight David Eisenhower in the 1950s started with the interstate highway system. So that's the federal government infusion into roadways that actually affected and changed urban areas, right? And so simultaneously in the 1950s, the transit was still being run by cities. So we were so behind that when you then come to 2020 and try to compare our transit with our roadways, it's a ridiculous comparison because we didn't start at the same place. All right, so that's a piece of what do people not necessarily realize. The other thing I think people don't realize is, well, they kind of do, because when they travel, they realize it, but then they come home and say, oh, well, we can't have that in Texas because we're too spread out. But the other thing people don't realize is that transit is actually the better option when you have it.
Yes.
So again, I think that we're just in a place where people just don't really get it. And so you ask yourself, so what do we do about that? And so you've got two options. Either you try to tell them or you keep pushing and just try to show them. And I'm not going to try to answer that question about how we should proceed, but those are the two choices, either trying to educate them so that they understand, or just keep doing it so that they see it.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I think I just finished reading a book for a upcoming class this semester called The Big Rich, all about essentially how Texas is just ingrained forever in natural gas and oil, and just kind of the way that things have turned out. And it's so interesting, the timeline that you're mentioning, because with Eisenhower, I mean, he was kind of in bed with the natural gas and oil people here in Texas, if we, to use that phrase. And it's just, I sometimes just wonder how we kind of get out of that transit rut that we've put ourselves in based off of just the history of Texas, and saying, oh, it's too wide open spaces, we'll never have anything that'll work. It's like, well, that's a lie. Like, there could be something, but we don't see it, and we don't understand the benefits.
Right. I think another thing that kind of gets us off track is that people think of it as an all or nothing decision. So either I'm going to be a transit user or I'm going to have my car. I think that's 100% wrong, and it's especially wrong for us.
Mm-hmm.
We are a society and a community, and I'm saying the whole state of Texas, that should be a trip purpose and then outcome kind of society. Where am I going? And is the car better for this trip, or is transit better for this trip? And we need them both. So I'm a big advocate of this is not an either or question. We do need some more roads. We do need some improvements in our roadway system. We do. But we also need commensurate or more improvements in our transit so that it can kind of catch up. And at the end of the day, is we want robust roadways and we want robust transit. And then the citizenry, to look at the trip, figure out which trip is better for me to make by transit, which trip is better for me to make by my car, and then do that. And then the equilibrium of that would reduce our congestion a bit, improve our air quality a bit, and get us to all the places and really be more efficient and for us and effective as travelers. So if we get to this equilibrium place, if we could ever get to the point that we sort of optimize the roadway system, optimize the transit, and use them to work together in the way that they should.
Absolutely. I really like that combination of both, because I think a lot of times when I talk to people who have maybe ridden the bus once or taken a train a single time, they're like, oh, but the wait, and it's, there's, and I just love my car. And I'm like, but wouldn't you rather be able to read in the car, or maybe, grade some papers or do something for work? Like, you have such ease, especially when you're taking a long trip. Maybe you'll get stuck in rush hour. Like, being able to really take these two separate modes of transportation and say, okay, so is this going to be better or is this going to be better? But having that option, and right now in Texas, at least, there really isn't that option everywhere.
But see, the rest of that, though, is that if people were actually making the choices appropriately, there would be more transit and the wait would be shorter. So the thing is, the wait is what it is, because the transit agency has to sort of balance the ridership, with, they can't put it out there if the people aren't there to ride it. And if they don't have enough money to put more service out there, it's sort of a chicken and egg, that in order for the the transit to be more frequent, we need more of it. In order for it to be more of it, we need to pay for it. So, we kind of get stuck in this circle.
Absolutely. This makes me excited though, hearing this from you. I'm keeping that faith up that we'll be able to get there.
Remember the science of muddling through.
Yes, I'm going to read it. I am. So I think that's a good segue for us to hear from you what you think your personal accomplishments and successes have been so far within this kind of transit space in the past and presently, and maybe giving us some tidbits of future projects you're working on, if that's anything relevant.
All right. So historically, when I was working at Metro, I was actually over. I was the director of planning when I left there. So from that standpoint, I had done a lot of the park and rides, a lot of the transit centers. I was one of the two people, Jeff Arndt, who currently is the head of VIA in San Antonio, and I made the presentation to our then Metro General Manager to do the first transit center in Houston at Lockwood and Lyons. So the two of us were in there presenting that transit center concept. And he told us, he actually, thank goodness, he, it was the days of chivalry. So he says, well, Jeff, if this transit center concept doesn't work, I'm going to name it the Jeff Arndt Memorial Transit Center. So I don't know if Jeff even remembers that, but anyway, the transit center concept did work, and now Metro has something like 17 of them. So I'll just kind of leave that one there as just a, kind of a backdrop from that era. And then when I was at the city of Houston, I was chair of the planning commission under Mayor Bill White. And we were able in that particular planning commission to get the first transit oriented development ordinance passed for the city of Houston. So that was a very intense effort, and it was a learning experience too. And I'm gonna tell you one thing that's integrally linked with this whole transit pursuit, and is getting the public to go along with you. And so one of my most favorite public involvement vignettes comes from that experience of getting that development ordinance passed. So first of all, we had a small group, a subgroup of commissioners who were working with the development community to get this transit ordinance passed, to get them to nod their head and say, okay, because the development community in Houston is really powerful. So we're working with them to get this ordinance passed. And one of the people was adamantly opposed. I mean, opposed with vigor. And so we thought we were going to be able to do this in 3 months. Our original timeline was 3 months. It took us 18. So there you go with, okay, be patient. And so the takeaway lesson from that was that we had forged such a relationship that the person who was really against it said to us, I'm going to be out of town on August 18th. If you want to get this through council, take it that day. I mean, that was the relationship, because we had been working with him for 18 months, and he was never going to say yes, but he liked us, right? So he's like, okay, you guys just really want, okay, I'm going out of town to do it. We got together like we were scurrying like crazy. So what happens at city councils when you have something on the agenda like that you're trying to get through and you haven't had time to really work it, you're behind the council sitting with the council members individually, telling them what it is, why they should vote for it. So we were back there like crazy. But anyway, we got it passed on August 18th. So that was the transit development ordinance for the city of Houston. The thing that I'm working on right now, and I kind of fast forward to what I'm working on right now. I'm kind of working on a thing right now, which I think will excite you all. As chair of the Gulf Coast Rail District, and that's an appointment from Mayor Turner of the city of Houston, Judge Hidalgo of Harris County Judge and Commissioner's Court that appoints me chair. And so one of the things that we're doing, I have to say we have two goals. One is to, roadway safety with railroads and doing grade separations, because Houston has like 1,700 of them. It's crazy. And then the other thing we do is to work on commuter rail. So across the years, the decades, takes a long time, we've done a lot of studies, and one of them is for commuter rail up to 90, which goes from Houston, in our region, Houston, up to what I call College Station Highway 6.
Yeah.
And then we also have the West Park Corridor, which our assessment shows should be BRT as opposed to commuter rail. That's fine, but it's not under our enabling legislation. So that's kind of a, you know, kind of a pony glitch as you go through. So Gulf Coast Rail District is, from the Texas legislature, is given the authority to do commuter rail, but we're not given the authority to do anything like BRT. All right, but move on from that. And then the 98 corridor down to Missouri City, Sugar Land, Stafford, and the like. We've also looked at commuter rail down to Galveston, but that's a problem. I won't take the time to tell you what it is. And then we have a north corridor going up kind of to the Woodlands. So, but our three sort of priority corridors are the ones on the west side, 290, West Park, and 90A. Well, our lowest hanging fruit is actually 290, because with the Texas Central High-Speed Rail, we have a memorandum of understanding with them that our commuter rail can be under their right-of-way when it's inside of Beltway 8 in Houston. So that gets us a portion of our path. Now, the big deal is at this moment, we have no money. So we're working on funding scenarios. I'm hoping in about a year, 18 months, I'll tell you on my sidebar in a minute, but I'm hoping in a year that we can have actually some real momentum on identifying funding for the 290 corridor. That's our lowest hanging fruit. My dream is, you know, you all know Cap Metro in Austin owns the first 50 miles of that right of way heading south. That leaves about 50 miles in the middle to connect the two. So my dream is for us one day to have commuter rail between Houston and Austin. Now, as a side, isn't that a great idea? Literally, I have not told this to any single person and gotten negative feedback, not anybody. As a matter of fact, there's one person in Austin that I told, and that person responded, well, that's the only thing that would make me support commuter rail down 290, is if it could go all the way to Houston. So I was like, yes. So my first sidebar to that was that I have this axiom, and it's whatever the schedule I think it will take me. Everybody who works with me and my students, I know this. Whatever amount of time I think it will take me to do something, multiply it by 4. So I just told you that I wanted to get this financing in a year. So I had to laugh because with my own axiom, it would be 4 years before we get it. Okay, but move on. So the other kind of sidebar to that is in my research at Texas Southern University, we've got a consortium with UT Austin, School of Architecture, School of Public Affairs, folks you all know who might be in, who actually are on this as well. Ming Zhang is our PI, he's in School of Architecture. Mm-hmm. Dr. Sandy Rosenblum, who I think is in LBJ School of Public Affairs, she's on the team. And then there's some folks from CTR that are on the team as well. That's UT's Center for Transportation, who are on the team as well. Lisa Loftus-Otway. And so what our particular piece is at Texas Southern University, everybody's got their own pieces of work, but our particular pieces of work are to identify the vulnerable communities along the 290 corridor that would benefit from having transit and be able to get into the urbans. We're focusing on these particular categories of need. We're focusing on education. Another little sidebar, did you know that there are 13 universities between Houston and Jay is not, 13 schools and universities along the 290 corridor? Wow. All right, we're looking at education. We're looking at health, and the health is not just, it's specialty medicine that someone could get on a train and go to a doctor. So like somebody with lupus or somebody with fibromyalgia who honestly could get on a train and go to their specialty doctor, that the specialty doctor doesn't exist anywhere between Houston and Austin, but those specialty medical personnel are in the urbans. So the specialty medical is, and then the workforce. So the research we're doing is asking this particular question. Number one is identifying what are those vulnerable communities, extremely vulnerable. They're below the poverty, they are in the poverty level in Texas. And if they could get into the urbans for education, you know, those three things, education, work, or specialty medicine, you know, it would strengthen the areas in the middle. So the other thing is, so this commuter rail, if we could get it going, I have to start with just my piece first though, you know, down here, is how can we strengthen people's capacity to better educate themselves, get better jobs, and continue to live where they live. So there are reasons that they live there, mostly the cost, right? But also you know, their senior relatives might be there and all that. So just a whole quality of life thing we think would be better for the people in the middle if there are a way for them to get to the urbans fairly quickly and affordably for things they need. So that's what I'm kind of working on in the future.
That's so exciting.
Just a
Look,
little
in
project.
truth, it'll probably be 2035 or 2040, honest to goodness, before we get rail all the way from here to there. But at least if we start on it, and you know, this one thing I say is 2035 and 2040 is going to come where we work on this and get to it or not. So we might as well just start working on it and try to get to it. So when we get to 2035 or 2040, at least then we have it.
At least we're further along.
We're further along.
You know,
I think that's critical.
the Austin is going to have a big transit vote on the ballot, and the first part of the Green Line commuter rail to Colony Park will be funded with that proposal. And I am one of those who did not think that was the best transit investment, except for if you're talking about connecting all the way to Houston and even all the way to Galveston, and you get the UT medical branch involved. And so I tried to brand that idea as the brain train, and it's a large amount of all the universities in Texas would be on that line.
I know, they would. It's fascinating. The issue is going to be at this point technology, because if what you're talking about is light rail, we're not talking about light rail.
Right.
So we're liable to get a disconnect. And the thing is, there's not room for us to put catenary under. You know, there are a couple ways to think about it. I mean, not to get into a big technology conversation,
Right.
but there are some dual technology things. So perhaps we could attach the catenary once we get outside of Beltway 8 and have it so that it runs on something else. You know, you lower the catenary and it runs on something else from Beltway 8 into the station. But anyway, the thing about that is the technology compatibility.
Yeah.
I think actually the Green Line is proposed as a DMU, like a diesel.
Okay.
So it doesn't need the lines.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
I think speaking of looking towards the future to 2035 and 2040 and 2045, we have maybe one more question if there's time. We've been working on looking into how Texas metropolitan planning organizations can expand their use of scenario planning for the regional transportation plan and project selection processes. So we had a chance to go to the H-GAC meeting online the other day and hear about SWIFT and some of the cool tools that are headed our way. So I just wanted to ask, what would you suggest to MPOs about how to apply scenario planning in new ways to improve outcomes for our communities and sort of think of new ways to do things? How can we encourage people to consider ideas for the future to prioritize investments in transit or other types of transportation that usually sort of are not the priority?
Mm-hmm. Well, so first of all, you have to have a tool that allows you to do scenario planning in enough time for you to get responses back so that you know what your options are. That SWIFT tool, honest to goodness, when I saw that, because I've been involved with it the whole time, because they actually pulled together this steering committee, you know, over a year ago, while they stepped through this. When they showed us that product, I felt like a kid at Christmas. Honest to goodness, the planner in me, I was giddy. I literally was giddy. And so a tool like that allows, I think it's like 7 hours to do the scenarios, but you can do anything within a scenario. You can change the land use, you can change the transit, you can change anything within that SWIFT tool. So what that would allow is you to have a community meeting, have the public to say, okay, these are the things that we're interested in. And then you could have, you mix your community leaders with your agency folks, and you could either have come out of that with a couple of scenarios or 3 that you want to have evaluated. Then you can bring back to the people, what the outcomes of the various scenarios are. And so this tool, again, like it's 7 hours to run each scenario. So I mean, you're only going to have a meeting once a month or whatever. So in that time, you could run a couple, 3 scenarios, get the answers ready, and then bring them back. So this tool, something like that, really makes that something that can happen very quickly.
I guess maybe a clarification on that for our audience. How long would those sort of processes take before this technology was available?
I was just about to get to that. Literally, it could have been 6 months, because you would have had to have some individual crunching the economic portion. You would have had to have some individual trying to figure out the land use impacts. I mean, months, literally months. And so this takes what would be maybe a 6 month, and I knew I needed to say that because I was saying I was giddy about it coming out in 7 hours, and I'm saying people don't know what the comparison is. The comparison is months, 6 months sort of minimum, maybe 9. So you've got these scenarios, and in the 6 to 9 months, you only would have been able to do one scenario. You couldn't do multiples. You don't have the staff or the resources to do multiple scenarios like that. You would have had to pick your preferred scenario and put it into all this battery of examinations. And it would have taken a lot of personnel, first of all, and a lot of time. And then it would have taken, so between the money and the time, you'd only be able to do one. Well, now you can do, one in 7 hours. So it is quite phenomenal. I was trying like everything to get them to let me use it for my class second semester, because that exercise is exactly what I have my class do in my urban transportation planning class. But let me tell you what, each student basically did one scenario. And so I put them in groups so that one person pulls the population data, one person pulls the employment, one person pulls the transit. So that way, then they pool all the base data, and then they can, do their own scenario. But when they're doing their scenario, they pick one criteria that they want to look at, and with one goal and with one set of performance measures. So, across 3 months, they did one. So I'm sitting here saying, oh, if I can take this into them, I can put them in groups. They can do the different scenarios. Blah, blah, blah. You know what that means. What I was thinking, all those things in the middle. I'm thinking I can take this in my class. It would be awesome. Well, TxDOT being TxDOT, and I understand that it hadn't yet been released, and they didn't think they could. They didn't know. Not that they didn't think they knew. They couldn't let it come out because it hadn't actually been released. It's only been shown to this small working group. It hasn't gone through their processes and their cycles and their, appropriate channels to allow the tool to be shown. So let me tell you, to talk about the time it takes. When I saw this tool, it was January. It just got presented to H-GAC last week. So 7 months just to get to the point that they show it to the NPO. So it's been ready all of 2020, because it was maybe I saw it in December, because when I saw it, it was still enough time that I could have put it in my curriculum for spring. So I'm just thrilled about that. And the scenario planning is going to take us, light years ahead in our ability to look at our decision making and decide what we want, what we like, and make an examination of what we're willing to pay for, both in standpoint of our sustainability and in the standpoint of our finances.
So once we, I guess, now that we can have so many more scenarios, once these tools are widely available, how do we take these lots of new options and get people to consider ones that are significantly different than how things have been done in the past? Because sometimes there's a lot of inertia to change things.
The key to that is starting off with you identified and agreed on set of goals. So at the very beginning, you decide what you want, what's important to you. And you just like in my class, I start my class off with, you start off with your goal. What is it you're trying to achieve? You give yourself criteria. How do you want to measure? And then you tell how you're going to measure. And so you start off with that at the very beginning. And so if the heads in the room nod, these are our goals, these are our criteria, and these are how we're going to measure. Then once you get to the scenario outcomes and you see how things have come out, you look at those vis-a-vis your goals, your criteria, and your performance measures. Now, what happens a lot, and some of this you can't predict, is that there are going to be sometimes you end up with a horse race, right? That this particular option is better on land use, but this particular option is better on travel time. And so your goals and your criteria aren't necessarily going to help you because your goal is travel time and your goal is, whatever I just said. So the thing is, there are going to be some things that are going to have to be negotiated at the end. That's just a part of the public processing, is there's just some negotiating. One of my classes in political science a long time ago and you all may have done this too, the takeaway is what is good policy? And that's actually the core of the science of muddling through as well. Is the good policy something that is calculated, or is the good policy the consensus making? And so, at the end of the day, and then after Lynn Bloom did the science of muddling through, there was pushback from this man. I can't remember his first name, but it was YDOR, Door. And so they kept doing the yin and the yang on the muddling through or the not. And so I think the truth of the answer is that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that you do have to, do your scenario planning and get as much detail as you possibly can. On the other hand, you're going to have to do some of the consensus building, and the good policy, the policy out, is going to have to be what's negotiated.
Thank you very much. It's been an interesting thing to learn about so far, and hopefully it'll work out for the future. Thank you.
Absolutely.
If only there was a major public $8 billion decision about the I-45 corridor that could benefit from this kind of swift tool.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But
I think that the thing that is going to happen, but here's where we are. Where we are is that the Transportation Policy Council's committee, I'm fairly certain, will start off with a set of common goals. And I've actually heard, I'm thinking about how to word this, from voices one can believe at TxDOT. Not that they're voices one can't believe, but someone who's in a position to say it and say it knowledgeably, that looking at the list that came from Mayor Turner's office, that the goals are largely the same. So the next steps are going to be how to get at those goals. Now, here's the issue. We won't be able to look at probably more than one or two scenarios in terms of this redesign of the facility itself. But I, for one, am fairly confident that we're going to get to Pareto suboptimal, meaning that obviously the majority of stakeholders will be better off. There will be some people who will not be happy, and there will be some people who will take some loss, quite frankly. But I mean, I think that's something that's important to admit at the beginning, that there are going to be some people who are going to be unhappy here, right? But what it's important for us to do is to make that facility safer, because it is not as safe as it can be right now. And on the TPC meetings and on the record, I've said every time this has come up, that freeway needs to be redesigned. It does. It is not safe enough. Secondarily, there are flooding problems. And, as I've said, the flooding problems they are partially because of where TxDOT put some columns, right? But the flooding problems along that freeway are not 100% attributable to TxDOT. TxDOT could push back and say, look, all of the development that you allowed upstream without proper drainage and so forth are contributing to. So there's a lot of responsibility to go around about flooding, but this offers an opportunity to fix it. And so then lastly, I'll just say you've got the whole question of, what is the best mobility option for that corridor? And right now, I don't think anybody would say we've got the best mobility option right now going on at I-45 North. So what are the things that we agree on? We agree that the freeway needs to be safer. We agree that the flooding can be addressed. And we agree that we need to do some mobility improvements in the corridor. What do we also agree on? We agree that it is intensely important to maintain the integrity of the communities.
Mm-hmm.
What's been asked for is the integrity of the communities. And so we need to, to honor that and to try to make sure we do the best we can with it. And that's the area where there's going to be probably a degree of unhappiness, because you can't do those first three things we said we want to and stay within the existing footprint. It's not really possible. But we can really narrow and winnow the volume of discomfort. And so that's what we need to be trying to do. It's still going to cost a lot of money, Jake. At the end of the day, it'll probably still be $8 billion. and that is on my other sidebar, what I'm taking in on my brain, because I've done this, this sort of newspaper, thumb in the air calculation that the commuter rail down to Missouri City and Sugar Land and Rosenberg, Richmond is about $4 billion. But I figure if we're going to spend $8 billion on I-45, we can spend $4 billion going down there.
Great point.
We just have to get it. We have to get the $4 billion, but it's not out of line to spend $4 billion on commuter rail to the Southwest.
Absolutely. Well, this has been so wonderful, and I've received some great advice and some interesting, exciting notes on what's to come in the future. So I'm native Austinite, so I spent some time on the coast, sometimes in Rockport, so it's really nice hearing about what all is going on in the state, and it seems like you have some really exciting things coming up, and we're really happy that you had the time to meet with us today, and it was just really wonderful, and we're very grateful.
Good. I'm glad and got a chance to meet you all, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, how can I pull you all into some of my projects? I'll just be talking to Jay about how to get you all involved with some of what's going on over here.
Yeah, that would be wonderful, and I'm sure we would all be in on that. So would love to do that.
Great.
Well, then for policy drivers today, this has been our discussion with Dr. Carol Lewis, and we will see you all next time.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lewis.
You're welcome.